Hello. Simplex is the name, Eurospy is the game. Today we're breaking the trend of looking at films from 1967 and instead having a look at an entry from 1965. With a character, due to his codename obviously being a step up from Bond, a magic McGuffin wind mineral which has the great property of plot convenience, and a whole lot of Napoleonic display pieces, the film today is Superseven Calling Cairo, a rather fine Eurospy directed by Umberto Lenzi. So, welcome back to Eurospy Cinema, a series where I review various movies that fit into the Eurospy category. The film today begins with our hero, Martin Stevens, spending time with a female enemy agent. After successfully foiling her plans to kill him with a gun disguised as a pen, we are plunged into the opening title sequence, which gives us a nice introduction to the fact that we'll be spending most of this film in Cairo. But first we go to England, specifically the Waterloo National Museum, which seems to be some kind of training ground for MI6 or whatever organisation it is that Martin works for. He is then called to meet with this film's version of M, the Professor. Martin is tasked with finding a piece of a stolen secret metal, Boltonium, which has been melted down and turned into the zoom part of one of 80 cameras sent to a dealer in Cairo. So it's Superseven's job to head there and track down who owns this camera. Interestingly, the film does mention the Q department here, of course not to be confused with Q branch, who have prepared for Martin all of the papers that he'll need to assume his alternate identity in Cairo as a curator of Napoleonic relics. Don't worry, that very specific identity will come into play later. In Cairo, Martin then meets a female enemy agent by the name of Faja, who has been sent to get information out of Martin but failed. Martin then tells her, "Hey, why don't you just work for me?" And so she decides why not. Martin meets with his contact, who gives him a radio disguised as an electric shaver, and Martin then buys a pair of sunglasses at the place where the camera containing the Boltonium was sold. He meets the shop assistant there, Denise, and makes a date with her, claiming that he's James Bond. With this incredible display of wit, they both burst out into laughter. Meanwhile, we're introduced to Alex, the big bad of the film, who crushes the incompetent camera salesman with a car. Martin then goes out to find the camera person, but to no avail. They do, however, discover that Alex is an ex-Nazi, though. The body then of one of Alex's girls, Tanya, shows up at Denise's house in an attempt to frame the duo for her murder. So Martin springs into action. He gets all of his Napoleonic relics shipped over to Denise's place in record time, and then dresses up Tanya's body as one of the dummies. When the police arrive, they are told that one of the neighbours must have just thought that the dummies were bodies. It's an elaborate and ludicrous set of contrived circumstances, but I do like the payoff for Martin's very obscure cover story. Later that night, it's discovered that the man who bought the camera is a certain Dr. Arnold Bolden, who was on holiday. He recently took a flight to Rome, so Martin sets out to follow him then. Unfortunately, Martin's contact Yusuf is killed trying to get this information to him. And Martin then realises that his room has been bugged this whole time and that the baddies are also on their way to get to Dr. Bolden. However, once they land in Rome, they find out that the doctor has flown on to Switzerland, and they follow by car. On the way, Martin leaves Denise at a hotel against her wishes and drives on to the doctor's place. Unfortunately, the doctor is killed by some baddie assassins, but Martin recovers the camera. It turns out now that Denise is actually in cahoots with Alex, and they both come in and surprise Martin. They threaten him that they will kill Faja if he doesn't hand over the Boltonium. Conveniently, the villains don't watch Martin very closely when he goes to get the Boltonium, and while he does it, he quickly sets up his radio in the bathroom to transmit their conversation. Alex then takes Martin and Faja with him on his speedboat, while British intelligence pick up the transmission and move in to intercept. Conveniently, the bad guy's boat breaks down, so Faja then uses this moment to take a blade out of Martin's shoe and cut them loose. Martin then swiftly pulls his pen gun from the pre-title sequence out and kills Denise before the two of them jump overboard. All this while Alex misses shots with his Tommy gun at point-blank range. Martin then blows up the boat with what he calls a micro-bomb, and the two are saved. Back in England, the Professor, Martin's boss, is wondering where Martin is. It turns out he's on a flight to Paris with Faja. He receives a cable from his boss then, informing him that his leave is cancelled and he must return to Cairo immediately. And the film ends there. The plot of Superseven Calling Cairo is not terrible. It's a simple story about locating a McGuffin, but it does have its ups and downs. On the problematic side is the actual setup for the story. For instance, the Boltonium was apparently stolen last week, but why Martin isn't notified and put on the job sooner is never explained. I guess it was probably all of that government red tape. Another odd thing is that the boltonium is said to be 100 times more radioactive than uranium, but for the sake of plot convenience, is also capable of being handled safely without the use of any protective equipment. I feel like there are a multitude of different reasons that could have been used to explain why the metal was supposed to be special, but then the writers came up with one of the few reasons that meant they did have to try and justify themselves with the explanation that, oh, it's completely safe to handle, we promise guys. And even with this explanation, it prompts the thought as to why Martin just didn't use a Geiger counter to locate the correct camera once he had a rough idea of where it was. There is a also rather contrived plot point when Faja decides to, after spending an evening with Martin, suddenly change to his side. At first I thought this was her only pretending to work with him to retrieve information from him, but no, she just changes to his side. What makes it even stranger is that Faja acts as if she owes it to work for the baddies and that there are dangers if she doesn't. So it's very odd that even when Martin leaves her in multiple situations that she could very easily escape or turn back to working for them, she doesn't. Nonetheless, there is a very interesting twist in the film when Faja tries to kill Denise. In the scene, it is framed in such a way that Faja comes into the room and then suddenly seems to try and shoot Martin, who's with Denise, only for her to miss, and as actually they say later in the script, it also supposedly jams. I don't exactly know what's going on there, but anyway, near miss for Martin is what I thought when I first saw the scene. But once it's revealed that Denise has had ulterior motives this whole time, the scene is recounted that Faja has recognized Denise as one of Alex's operatives and quickly tried to dispatch of her. It's quite a nice reveal, and it actually does add to the film as the whole villain-good guy dynamic between the two female leads is completely reversed in quite a short space of time. Though I have to say I still do wonder why Faja didn't simply tell Martin this, but I can excuse the film for that, as, you know, the idea to actually set up and pay off this kind of twist is quite impressive writing and shows that the writers didn't simply want to make a quick buck, but they actually did care about creating some kind of mystery and intrigue for this plot. The story here also includes a lot of references to Napoleon for some reason. Not only is Martin's cover that he's a curator of Napoleonic relics, but MI6's headquarters are also in the Waterloo National Museum. The best thing I can think of for this is that the writers wanted their own version of Bond's Universal Exports, but even then it had only appeared in Dr. No up to this point, so maybe they were just really enamored with the idea when they read the books. Nonetheless, it does seem like a kind of odd cover story for the British Secret Service or whatever this organisation is. Surely making your cover story be centred around something super specific like the Napoleonic War would only draw more attention to you rather than the boring and uninteresting universal exports? But I'm probably reading too much into this. The inclusion of such a cover story as a through line for the entire film is really cool, a great detail to notice in one of the lower budget Eurospy films. The film was directed by Umberto Lenzi and was his second foray into the Eurospy scene after making a string of historical epics such as Samson and the Slave Queen, Catherine of Russia, The Triumph of Robin Hood. His first Eurospy was actually the interesting 008 Operation Exterminate, a film that I do hope to cover in future, and I think that having that first film under his belt definitely contributed to making Superseven Calling Cairo a much more streamlined film. The film, in fact, was based on a book written by Umberto, S7 Calling Cairo. And because of this, he's also credited as writer and was the key creative influence over the entire film. For the most part, he directs the film in a very classic and straightforward way. It doesn't feel particularly complex, and there isn't much to note. But on the other hand, it does present everything in a respectable and easy-to-follow manner. Unlike numerous other Eurospy films, I did not feel the need to rewind the film to try and understand the meaning of a scene, as everything's very clearly shown. However, this could also be because of the rather simple find and get nature of the plot too. Music-wise, it's pretty great for about 50% of the time, but then for the other 50% of the time, it's pretty repetitive and irritating. An example of some of the great music is the incidental piece that plays when Martin arrives in Cairo. It's eerie and really sells the unsettling and unwelcoming nature of the new environment. Another great instance is the great choice of music when Martin is sneaking through the home of Dr. Bolden. The scene features diegetic choir music, which really adds to the tension and honestly makes this one of the best scenes in the film. It's so good. However, some of the music gets pretty repetitive. For instance, every chase features the same music, and by the time the third chase rolls around, it becomes pretty annoying to listen to. Actors-wise, we have Roger Brown playing Martin Stevens, aka Superseven. It's obvious why he was picked for the film. He looks kinda like a mix between Sean Connery, Charles Gray, Robert Vaughn, and it's not a bad thing by any stretch, but you can tell why they wanted him, so that they could stick his likeness on the poster. And overall, Brown is a fairly good actor. Of course, I was watching a dubbed version of the film, so that definitely colours things a bit, but he seemed engaged and, for the most part, sold himself as a super spy a lot better than some of the other Eurospies of the same year. His English voice actor in the dubbed version I have is also very eloquent, with scenes like this.
Don't make a move. I'm sorry to have to do this, but I have no other choice, even if it causes international complications. You'll understand everything later.
It's pretty funny dubbing, as oftentimes the dialogue he's speaking is completely mismatched with the cool, calm, collected spy look he wears. His character is written to be intelligent, but he's never smart enough to the point of becoming irritating. Rather, he does quite a nice job of walking the fine line of always being just one step in front of the audience. A good example of this is his coming to the realization that Denise is evil. Although we don't see when his suspicions were first aroused, we do see him examining some footage for proof of it, and we also see him lying to her to see if she'll take the bait. It's all very well constructed to make Martin come across as a very competent lead. Brown's character, I think, is best likened to Roger Moore's Bond, as he acts as an agent who charms the information out of female agents rather than the rougher approach that was taken by Connery at this time. And this plays into a contrived plot point I mentioned earlier when Faja, after spending only a little time with Martin, suddenly changes to the side of good. It is just flat out strange behaviour on her part, but since Martin is portrayed as such a charming personality, you can kind of explain it away as that. The character of Martin does have a few annoying moments though, such as when he claims that he's James Bond and we get that awkwardly extended sequence of him laughing. But for the most part, these moments are few and far between. Fabienne Daly plays Denise, Martin's female companion for the majority of the film. Daly does a nice job playing the part, acting convincing while pretending to be on Martin's side and then being menacing once it's revealed she's working with Alex. I do wish this got to be explored a little bit more in the film, as she's a pretty solid villain, but she just doesn't really get a whole lot to do besides scowling at Martin while they're zipping away on the speedboat. For the most part, she's just sidelined as soon as anything interesting is about to happen. For instance, when Martin leaves her at the hotel to pursue the doctor alone. It makes sense story-wise, however. Martin doesn't want a person who he suspects to be an enemy agent following him around, but it isn't great for the character, as she just gets very little opportunity to do anything. Massimo Serrato portrayed the Nazi lead villain, Alex, and he's pretty solid overall. I have no complaints about him, as he's pretty menacing. He, much like many other Eurospy villains, is a brains character, having sweeping plans but never really doing any of his own dirty work, an aspect which I think quite fits the actor's physicality. He is depicted as ruthless and cunning through a number of times where he bumps off his inadequate henchmen, and he's especially menacing with the way he dispatches of the camera salesman under the car. It's quite gruesome. His chemistry with Roger Brown isn't too bad, and he definitely does do a nice job as a villain. Though I must admit that I wish he was a little more bombastic with how he approached things, as his writing can make him a little forgettable. But the actor does a solid, perfectly adequate performance of the character. His intelligence does seem to be diminished a fair bit when it comes to his interactions with Martin though, where Martin easily outsmarts him multiple times and Alex never seems to learn from these interactions. Another issue I have with the character just stems from how cliché he is. An ex-Nazi mastermind who's after some secret scientific discovery to sell to the highest bidder. It's not particularly original, but overall I don't really feel like it detracts from the film that much. Stella Monclar played Faja, and she's pretty solid too. The actress does a fairly good performance, but the script for her character is really what lets her down. Her motivations are very vague and generally illogical, as I've covered before. For instance, she begins as a villain and then, due to Martin's charms, turns to the side of good. She makes no objection to openly working with Martin, despite being well aware of the deadly consequences of those who betray Alex. and then makes no attempt to get back into contact with the villains either. It's very odd. However, overall, the biggest problem with Faja is much like Denise. She's just absent from the film. She just simply disappears a short time after being introduced and then only reappears near the end. It's such an odd thing, almost as if the scriptwriters didn't know what to do with her, so they just simply didn't write her in. Now we're on to one of my key highlights of the film, Antonio Gradoli as Yusuf. Gradoli is amazing. His character is, on paper, a pretty bland exposition-providing ally for Superseven, but the actor does so much with the character. His introductory scene is nothing special, and honestly at first tricked me into thinking he would be another basic Bond character stereotype. But after this, his actor really gets into the part with shifty eyes and giving Martin strange looks every few minutes, even wearing a rather unconvincing wig at one point. He's very good. The only pity is that the English dub for the actor seems to be a little bored. The actor most probably wasn't watching the film or reading his lines, which can result in some very plain deliveries. Nonetheless, all these good elements about the character contributed to me being very sad when, unfortunately, he's killed off, since he doesn't actually get very much screen time. Minodoro was the Professor, who is, as is common in most Eurospy films, our knockoff M. I really like analysing Eurospy takes on the M character. It's supplied some really interesting interpretations, such as Assassination's intense and deranged Bill Vanders, or Danger Death Ray's overly disapproving Senor Raymond. In this film, we sadly don't get anything particularly interesting. I like the idea of having a professor heading up the organisation as a kind of nod to the organisation's museum cover, but in practice it kind of falls a bit flat. I feel that Doro doesn't have a commanding enough presence to be Mike's boss. He's fine, don't get me wrong, but there's just nothing particularly stellar about the performance. And this is definitely not helped by another pretty pathetic dubbing job where the actor puts very little feeling into his voice. However, it's not all bad. Something which is very rare is that the professor returns in the film's epilogue to tell Martin that he can't have a holiday. This scene is by far his best, as the actor actually puts some good feeling and character into his character. It is unfortunately let down a bit with another lackluster dub, but I guess you can't have everything. There are a few pretty good scenes to keep an eye out for in this film. The first of those is the Rome airport scene. Somewhat reminiscent of a similar scene in From Russia with Love, it basically is Martin going through the airport contacting different people for information on his target, all the while the baddies are tailing him to try and find out what the info he's recovering is. It's quite good. I love the classic espionage approach it presents, with all the cool call signs and such used to pass on the information. And I do think the fact that the baddies follow them so easily is a little silly, but, it's a minor gripe for an overall pretty solid sequence. Another scene which is done very well is when the baddies torture Martin in the back room of a club. It can be rare to find a Eurospy which handles torture sequences well, but this film really delivers. The main thing that really elevates the sequence is the editing. The sequence constantly cuts between the torture and a dancer in the club, which, combined with the diegetic music of the club, leads to a really intense sequence. I really like it. Brown delivers some great acting throughout too, really portraying the agony his character's feeling so well. It's a very good scene editing-wise, and honestly I was quite surprised when it came up as to how good it really was. Action-wise, the film has some fairly solid action sequences, most of them, however, being in the latter half of the film. The first one of note I would definitely say is the fight stealth sequence I mentioned earlier when Martin is sneaking through the home of Dr. Bolden. Alongside the great choice to use diegetic choir music to score it, the lighting is very atmospheric and the stealthy fight is quite well done. It's honestly probably the best scene in the film and definitely elevates some of those lesser points I mentioned. It is a little goofy when we get some very obnoxious and quite disconcerting day shot to look like night shots preceding this scene, but once we get into the house it gets really good. The other much more action-focused action sequence of note is a shootout in a field of old car wrecks. It's a pretty unique setting which elevates an otherwise fairly generic gunfight between Martin and one of Alex's henchmen. Considering the henchman is one who appears a number of times throughout the film and is basically really the secondary antagonist, it is a nice way to dispatch the character as opposed to Alex's rather hilariously small-scale exit from the film in the bomb explosion scuffle. Gadget-wise, the film has a few interesting ones, even if they do mostly act as a plot convenience. The first of these is Martin's pen gun. It appears 3 times in the film, including the opening scene and that final fight with Alex. Its multiple appearances kind of frame the film almost, and I like the fact that it gets multiple appearances. Often in these films, and Bond too actually, a gadget is used once and then never mentioned again, so I really appreciate that the writers remembered it and then returned back to it a few times. The next gadget we see is Superseven's Shaver Radio. A fairly basic gadget, much like the pen, the radio does actually serve the plot fairly well, leading to both the transmission of information between Martin and Yusuf and also the ultimate downfall of Alex. Another nice instance of gadget reuse. It overall isn't much to look at, but I do like the idea behind it. It could have easily been replaced with a normal radio, but instead was turned into a gadget for that more Bondian flavour. It's a nice touch. The final gadget of note, that is if you're not counting the lighter disguised as a gun thing that Martin has hanging around, is the false shoe sole that he has, which features a makeshift blade and the micro bomb. That's not particularly exciting and definitely feels like the most plot convenient of all of his devices. However, I like the idea and certainly not the worst solution for writing yourself out of a corner. Overall, Superseven Calling Cairo is honestly pretty good. It's one of the better Eurospies to watch, specifically if you're looking something akin to Bond. It features a number of Bond classics, such as the pre-title sequence, Q-Branch, and gadgets, and the concluding scene where, in this case, the Professor wonders where our hero has got to. It's overall quite nice, and a pretty well done emulation of the Bond formula, and I think could be worth your time. However, don't expect something very unique, nor a particularly big budget Bond recreation. It's just overall a nice middle-of-the-road film, which is a perfectly fine watch. Anyway, that's all I have for this episode of Eurospy Cinema, so I'll see you later. Goodbye.